PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Shawn David McGhee. He is the author of No Longer Subjects of the British King, The Political Transformation of Royal Subjects to Republican Citizens.
This week on PA Books, Shawn McGhee, author of No Longer Subjects of the British King.
Shawn David McGhee is the author of No Longer Subjects of the British King, The Political Transformation of Royal Subjects to Republican Citizens. Now, in the book, you talk about the emergence of a distinct American political community. When do you first start to see elements of that?
So this is an origin story, and I think we really begin to see what I call a sort of proto-national resistance movement develop after the Boston Tea Party. And if you'll permit me a moment to just walk us through to sort of set this conversation up. On December 16th, several dozen men, famously disguised, threw something like 342 chests of the Royal East India Company's tea into the sea. And John Adams writes in his diary famously that evening, the die is cast, recognizing the momentum of the moment. Of course, it's the 18th century. The die may have been cast, but they have to do a lot of waiting. And when news of the Boston Tea Party reaches Parliament and George III, this latest act of conspicuous and blatant insubordination angers an already quite upset George III, who demands Parliament find some way to, make the colonists more dependent on the metropole. Frederick North, the prime minister at the time, says we must either bend to them or make them listen effectively. And Parliament famously passes the Coercive or the Intolerable Acts. Now, this is a sort of bundle of punitive measures that were specifically designed to bring Massachusetts generally, but Boston to heel, to bring them into the within the governing of Parliament, and it shuts down it shuts down Boston Port. It changes the charter of Massachusetts. It installs Lieutenant General Thomas Gage as effectively a military dictator. In Massachusetts. It also passes what is famously called by George Washington the Murder Act, which allows British officials to be tried specifically outside of Massachusetts, potentially even in England, depriving colonists a jury of their peers, and perhaps most famously for our textbooks these days, the Quartering Act. And getting back to the original question, when news of these acts begin to wash ashore in British North America in the summer of 1774, something quite organic begins to happen rapidly. And at the local level, we begin to see these resistance resolutions passed in like Elizabethtown, New Jersey, Perth Amboy, New Jersey, some of the parishes in Georgia, right? So from New England through the mid-Atlantic into the southern states, we begin to see local communities utterly outraged by what's happening in Boston. And it's not the familiar cast of characters. We're not specifically talking about Washington or Madison or Jefferson. These are just local leaders. They all signed their name to these resistance resolutions. And they are effectively standing in solidarity with Boston. And they're asking for some degree of economic coercion, right? So they're asking colonists to commit to self-denial. They don't purchase British goods. Some of them don't want American resources being sold to the British if it's going to help Parliament punish Boston further. Westmoreland County in Virginia goes a step further. As far as I was able to tell when I was doing my research for this project, it's the first time that the local resistance resolutions express a desire for their constituents to not only refrain from material leisure that's provided by British resources, but to stop attending to social behaviors that would broadcast any form of enjoyment, any form of like conspicuous displays of wealth, any form of entertainment. So long as Boston was suffering, everyone should suffer. And so we begin to see quite rapidly these grassroots resistance resolutions, and the language is remarkably consistent, and there is an impressive revolutionary lexicon that we begin to see develop with a few themes of resistance and a few different avenues of resistance. How can we actually go about doing something rather than being outraged with rhetoric, right? And I think that's where we begin to see the earliest outline, if you will, right, of a broader pan-colonial resistance community.
So before these events in Boston, did the colonists in the different colonies, that they were clearly subject of the British king, that was part of their identity, did they have a shared American identity?
Absolutely not. Not that I see, right? I think that they have an identity, and I think that's one of the more remarkable parts of this story, is this resistance movement didn't sort of generate out of an idea of like these are the elements that make us Americans. It was very local. Many of these local communities had particular rituals and rites and traditions and political arrangements that they were comfortable with. And they saw that what was happening in Boston was a threat to Massachusetts. Put another way, we like to say oftentimes, the mantra of the American Revolution is no taxation without representation, no taxation without representation. But what happens with the Coercive Acts is, I think, something far more alarming. Those punitive measures, that bundle of legislation that was passed in the Coercive or the Intolerable Acts, is legislation without representation. And I think that is a direct assault on local colonial identities. And those identities, they could be as specific as town identities or colonial-wide identities. But what they were holding on to were traditions, their way of governing. Their conception of self-governance was very, very local. Yes.
Now, you mentioned this call for self-denial. What was it about the colonial culture that was their go-to response?
So I think that's a great question. So I think from in the immediacy of now, I think that many of them were considering economic coercion. If we can deny British manufacturers American business, and that's reflected in the bottom line, then the people who can actually vote for members of Parliament would then begin to pressure those members to reconsider their political positions regarding the American colonies. Because again, no one in colonial America could vote in or out of office anyone in Parliament. And so, the lesson that Americans learned after the 1688 Glorious Revolution was not that only Parliament could tax them, but rather only their local representatives could tax them, people that they held politically accountable through the ballot. And yeah, I think that sums that up, I think.
How important was printing culture in the colonies at this time?
Fundamentally important. Print culture, I don't think that this movement would have been possible without print culture. Certainly there's a lot of letter writing going on. But these resistance resolutions are reprinted in all of the local gazettes, right, from New England to the South. The Georgia Gazette, right, the Massachusetts Spy, like all of these newspapers are reprinting other local resistance movements. And I'm sure our conversation will get there. When the First Continental Congress meets, print culture is front and center in sort of orchestrating a resistance narrative, plotting or putting rather colonists front and center in a grander imperial drama.
Well, let's talk about the First Continental Congress. How does the groundswell of momentum and emotion begin to lead to this idea of a pan-colonial Congress?
So in those local resistance movements, in addition to calling for colonists to adhere to self-denial, in addition to calling on all colonists to, stop selling American resources to the British, and in some rare instances, in addition to asking colonists to stop conspicuous displays of leisure and enjoyment, almost all of them ask for what they were calling then a Grand Continental Congress. And they wanted to have the collected wisdom of the land in a singular location. And in this assembly, most of these local resistance leaders legitimately expected the wise men of the land, effectively, to solve the problems of empire, right? So they're sent. These delegates will eventually be sent to Philadelphia, but those summer resolutions are effectively what ask for the convening of a Grand Continental Congress, and the expectation is some form of imperial reconciliation. And then if you want to go a little further down the line, imperial reconciliation in addition to settling British North American liberties on a sound and perpetual constitutional basis or foundation.
Now, part of the story you tell is about the narrative of the journeys of these delegates from their home communities to Philadelphia for this Congress. Why was that such a significant narrative?
So I think in the 18th century, we have to remember there's no internet, right? There are no television shows. They're doing a lot of reading. They're attending plays, but politics is naturally consequential, but it's also, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful fashion, but it's almost like a sport for 18th century Americans. That sport-like element obviously intensifies in the 19th century. But here we have a story being told in print media. These gazettes are telling colonists what's happening in the broader empire and inviting them to become part of that narrative. So when they're reprinting these resistance resolutions that are calling on all colonists to refrain from purchasing British goods, you can read about that, but you can also participate in the action that it's calling on. And when the First Continental Congress is called to meet in Philadelphia in September of 1774, each of these newspapers is giving the 18th century version of a play-by-play. When there are, if there were 5 delegates from North Carolina, you were informed, if you were reading the paper, that 4 of them have made it to Philadelphia. But don't worry, because the 5th one is mere hours outside of the city, right? So they're letting you know that these people are coming, right? The delegates are coming to Philadelphia, but it's so important that even an hour or a 2-hour delay is reported in the newspaper because of the gravity of the moment is such that everyone is going to be informed on the travels. When John Jay leaves, for example, he's actually one of the few that's able to quietly sneak onto a ferry and get to Philadelphia without much fanfare. But the other New York delegates are met with all the pomp and pageantry that you might imagine. Cannon fire, huzzas, people walking them to the ferry. There's accounts in the newspaper of audience members claiming that they would risk and sacrifice their lives to protect the brother delegates from the other colonies. So this is a recognition that on their part that this is a broader movement. It's not a New York movement. It's not a Massachusetts movement. It's not a New England movement or a Mid-Atlantic movement or a Southern movement. It's a pan-colonial movement. And I think that there is a clear recognition that while they are different, right, we're willing to sacrifice our lives for our brother delegates from other colonies. While they recognize that they're different, they recognize that they're all involved in the same struggle.
Well, you also mentioned that you could draw lines from tavern to tavern as they're traveling, as they make their way to Philadelphia.
Yes. So tavern culture becomes quite important. And on the way there are a lot of stories that are reflected in the record. Now, frustratingly, a character like Washington, who himself travels from tavern to tavern, doesn't have a whole lot to say. His diary may be one of the most frustrating documents to ever read. This is a man, I'm working on another project now and I'm involved in his papers again, but no matter what's going on, the greatest moment, it could be, crossing the Delaware or meeting in Philadelphia, he'll let you know which direction the wind was blowing that day. But there was a northwesterly breeze, and that's about the extent of it. But there are other characters, Silas Deane, We have, Caesar Rodney from the lower counties, or what ultimately we call Delaware. Obviously, John Adams he keeps a great record of what's going on. And what we see happening in the taverns is this socialization. I mean, we have to remember, we have this idea. I think the general public has this idea that these men that we've been learning about since grade school knew each other, when in fact they didn't. They didn't know, no one knew what George Washington looked like. No one knew what John Adams looked like. These men didn't know one another. They may have been big fish where they came from, but when they all gathered together in Philadelphia, the record reflects that these men they're suspicious of one another. They're a little jealous of one another. The only ones that had at Congress, the only individuals that have anything that even reflects something approaching a national reputation, I think, would be Washington, and to perhaps a lesser extent Dickinson. But the rest of them are unknown. So, tavern culture becomes really important. The official business may have happened within the chambers of Carpenter's Hall, but people becoming relaxed and comfortable and intimate with those delegates, that happens specifically outside of Carpenter's Hall. And so we have, several well-documented evenings where there's drunken patriotism, if you will, for lack of a better term, and they're sizing one another up. They're going to these taverns and they're offering toasts. And if they're not in taverns, they're in private boarding rooms doing the same thing, though. They're drinking a lot of punch. They're drinking a lot of beer. John Adams actually famously brags that he hasn't had any cider in a while because he's been drinking really good Philadelphia porter, right? He's quite excited about that. But they offer these, they called them sentiments then, but they're toasts. May the colonies be strong, and may parliaments will bend. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that's the sort of idea. And they would all raise their glasses and they would take a shot. And each of these moments of fraternity brought these men together closer, and they began to sort of let their guards down. They began to sort of be able to determine the levels of commitment to what they called then the common cause. We have some famous, if comical, descriptions of some of these founders. John Dickinson, John Adams wrote, he's as gray as ashes. He looks on the verge of death. He could keel over at any moment, but there's a fire in his heart. This man is a true patriot. Samuel Adams felt the same way. Adams famously described Caesar Rodney as, quote, the oddest looking man in the world, with a face no bigger than an apple, but a great patriot, a great supporter of the cause. And they form these Ciceronian friendships, right? The idea of friendship based off of Cicero, that men are only truly friends when they come together in support of a public cause. Men that are motivated not by private interests, but rather by advancing the public good. And that's the bond that these men form, and they form it to a large degree in the tavern. So, it's not unlike the Oval Office today, right? We think, how come President X or Y is golfing all the time? Well, because that's, or why are they always out to lunch, or whatever the case may be? Like, things may be, there's a photo op in the White House, but the real cajoling, happens outside of the White House. And I think there was a similar situation that unfolded here. The official business unfolded at Carpenter's Hall, but that business probably wouldn't have happened had it not been for the socializing that took place in the boarding houses, but of course most famously in the taverns. City Tavern is the place that they frequented the most. And in Washington, again, he doesn't say a whole lot, but ate out at City Tavern. That's about all. You get 10 or 11 instances in Washington's diary alone. But yeah, these men, they enjoyed themselves. There are a few of them who wrote their wives. I wish I could tell you what we were talking about, but we're eating out and drinking every night. And I know that doesn't sound like we're working very hard, but we're working really hard. We're working so hard that all we can do is drink and eat at the end of the night. That's generally the sort of characterization of those evenings, if you will, that we get out of the record.
You were talking about toasts, and those would be published in the newspapers, so they were becoming more public documents and public events.
Yes, these toasts there's one particular evening, I want to say that it's October 22nd, I could be off a few days one way or the other, that prints out, I think, 32 toasts. right? And the toasts are being reprinted in the newspapers. Famously, this one evening, shortly before Congress dissolves, the state assembly and state dignitaries of Pennsylvania offer a great feast for all of the delegates before they wrap up work on October 26th. And there are 32 toasts, cannon fire after each one. 32 shots, if you will. I mean, these men are, we'll say, mildly inebriated. This event is so famous that it's reprinted in the newspapers for over the course of several days. Ben Franklin has a friend of his send him a letter saying, "Hey, there's this great feast in Philadelphia, and they fired off a toast and a cannon shot for you, Dr. Franklin." So this toast this moment made its way across the Atlantic, this is what I argue in the book is these moments of sociability created a fellowship out of strangers. These men who arrived in Philadelphia not knowing what each other looked like, perhaps being a little suspicious or jealous of one another, they emerge from their roughly 2 months in Philadelphia together as an elite fellowship and a leadership class, if you will, of a more unified resistance effort. And I think a lot of that has to do with socialization and letting their guard down. Of course, we have to remember that the political culture was very different in the 18th century, and so these shots and these sentiments that they were offering one another, they were certainly experiencing intoxication, but they were deeply political moments. And even individuals in the room who were not part of Congress were partaking in these shots, and that's sort of signaling that they're supporters of the common cause. They're supporters of the Whig movement. So it's fun to talk about for sure, but we also have to keep in mind that this is a serious moment as well. These men may have been having a good time, but that good time results in a trust that's built, and that trust carries over into the chambers of the First Continental Congress, and the First Congress is able to get work done because these men grew to trust one another, specifically because of those moments where they were, letting their guards down a little bit.
Well, let's go into the chambers of the First Continental Congress at Carpenter's Hall. We take language about rights very much for granted today, since we're a few hundred years down the line. But one of the things that they had to debate were the origins of American rights. And what were their ideas?
So here we have one of the earliest examples of division. Again, the delegates who met at Congress were not, Robin Hood and his merry men. They definitely were interested in maintaining the political culture and traditions of where they came from. They also recognized that they had to work with people that maybe had slightly different ideas of political history and political culture. So when Congress begins the sort of journey of trying to express to Parliament that it feels that American rights are under attack, they begin with a conversation about where to locate rights. Where do American rights come from? And almost immediately, we have men like John Jay from New York, William Livingston from New Jersey, who begin to imagine that colonial rights come from a few different spaces. Naturally, they are to be found in the glory of the 18th century, what the English Constitution had become by then. But they also recognized that there were additional elements, that rights came from nature, right? That all of us, or all of them rather, came into the world, and life was granted by what they would have called then the grand architect of the universe, or the creator. So there's no parliament or prince that grants you life, right? That's a gift. That's of the natural bounty. That the original settlers crossed the Atlantic, and they have this sort of pseudo-mythological understanding of the colonial past, that these original settlers, some were fleeing persecution, some were just looking to advance their lot in life, but whatever the case may be, they came across the ocean, and at tremendous expense in personal blood and treasure, they tamed a wild land. They tamed a wild land that was riddled with dangerous Native Americans who didn't want them there, wild beasts who did their best, to destroy them. And so they get their life and their liberty from the natural world. but the sort of local traditions and identities that they want to protect are also reflected in colonial charters. And then, of course, the broad one, the Imperial Constitution. And so most delegates want to rest colonial rights on colonial charters, on natural rights, and on the British Constitution. And there's a conservative element in there. Duane from New York and Joseph Galloway from Pennsylvania are the leaders of this. I don't think that it's quite accurate to call it a faction, because it's a sort of a moving combination of individuals, but it's always Duane and Galloway that seem to be on the same side. And Galloway, and hopefully we can talk about him in a little while, because he's an impressive character. He recognizes very quickly that if colonial rights are based on anything that involves the natural world or the natural order, that's a slippery slope. So Galloway, and I'll come back to that in 1 second. So Galloway desperately wanted to root American liberty specifically and exclusively in the English Constitution. Americans get their rights because of the glory of the English Constitution. And if you locate them anywhere else, he recognized this, and this is in the record. If he went along with colonists agreeing that any of their liberties came from the natural order, then that's an indirect recognition that colonists were they voluntarily included themselves in the broader empire, because they're not directly attached by the English Constitution. If there's, in other words, if natural rights were why colonists had liberty in the first place, then what is their direct connection to the king? And it had to be voluntary. And if you're voluntarily part of the empire, you can voluntarily remove yourself from the empire. I don't know that Galloway's thoughts were that well conceptualized in September of 1774, but certainly by October he's recognizing that danger.
So as these delegates are meeting in Carpenter's Hall, what is the political agenda?
So what I argue in the book, and there are probably a few different ways to interpret this, but what spoke to me the clearest, they had a very simple agenda: imperial reconciliation and colonial moral regeneration. They want to bring the empire back together, but they want to bring the empire back together in a way that is not going to infringe upon the liberties that they already had. And going back to those summer resolutions from 1774, they not only demand those liberties, but they demand the right, the ability to pass those liberties on inviolate to their children, right? Every generation of Americans should have more, not less liberty, according to this thought process. So the first thing that they want is they want to solve the problem of empire, and that involves getting the Coercive Acts repealed immediately, and then further down the road, having Parliament recognize American rights and getting them in some fashion on a sound constitutional foundation. So rights that are on the record. And that gets a little slippery as well, because there's not exactly a written English Constitution. It's the sum total of like Parliament's decisions and legislation, and some of it's contradictory, some of it gets overturned over the course of centuries, or whatever the case may be. So there's a tradition. So they want something a little different, and we're looking at, we're getting in the direction of a written constitution, writing this stuff down. So the colonists want their rights back, and they want them firmly established on a constitutional basis, so this crisis doesn't unfold the next generation or the generation after that. And then I think the other part of the agenda, and this is the real historiographical intervention that my book offers, colonial moral regeneration. They want to get back to this sort of elusive and largely mythological moment of Republican simplicity. And we can go into that if you'd like in the future of our conversation, but that's the agenda. Get the empire back together, solve the colonial constitutional crisis, and guarantee colonial rights so no other generation has to deal with the current crisis, and then get Americans back to basics.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Let's talk about the influence of classical thinking on the culture of the time. People reference Cicero a lot. You mentioned before Ciceronian friendship as a value of theirs, but virtue was something that was important too. What did something like virtue mean to them?
So, virtue is a sort of umbrella term that they use. It's almost like a hidden language. But virtue is demonstrated publicly. Virtue involves having certain qualities that can be measured publicly. And the concept of virtue, in my book, I make the argument that virtue goes through a powerful transformation. Prior to 1763, virtue is all over the newspapers of the 18th century, but it's more of a rhetorical device. People should be virtuous. You should be virtuous. And there's never really too much of an explanation as to what it means. You should be disinterested, right? You should care about the public. When we get into the imperial crisis period, which is after 1763, virtue begins to get a clearer definition, what it means in that moment. And certainly by 1774, what virtue means to the colonists is you should be publicly disinterested. And today in the 21st century, our understanding of that word is, we use that word, I think many people use that word interchangeably with uninterested. I'm uninterested in the baseball game, or I'm uninterested in X, Y, and Z, or I'm disinterested in baseball, or whatever the case may be. But in the 18th century, that word was decidedly political. It meant that you could make a decision about the public without calculating your private lot. So in other words, what's good for the public might harm one individual financially, or might make someone's life a little more difficult, but it's better for the broader community, and therefore it's the only thing to do. It's the only thing that's right. Virtue is industry. Are you working, right? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you self-sustaining? When you're done being self-sustaining, are you contributing to your neighbor's sustainability? Virtue is frugality, right? Have you accumulated wealth, but that wealth that you've accumulated, is it going to be left, for a time of crisis, or is it going to be left for your children? Or are you just, conspicuously displaying it to show off, right? That's not virtue. Virtue is courage, right? Do you have the courage to make tough decisions? Do you have the courage to take up arms and defend the border, right? So virtue is a range of qualities, but in every respect, they reflect your willingness to do the right thing to advance the public good. And that's what virtue meant to them.
So something where you're putting aside your own personal interest in favor of the public interest.
Yes, even if your private interest is going to be harmed a little, or it's going to be made a little more difficult. If doing the right thing for the public harms you a little bit, that's virtue. I mean, Ben Franklin, in terms of industry, was famously virtuous. Even when he wasn't busy, he gave off, the illusion that he was busy. He's always moving like a wheelbarrow, and he's always doing something in the streets of Philadelphia. So people recognized that he was working. And he did that intentionally, right? This is broadcasting virtue. The record leading up to this crisis is littered from 1763 all the way through the crisis period. We need to start living off of potatoes and living off of the land. There's a great sort of interview that I have in the book where one of John Adams' friends speaks to a sea captain in Boston who's out of work. And he asks the sea captain, hey, don't you think we should just sort of reconcile with Parliament? And he says, I will live off of lobster before I reconcile with Parliament. Of course, lobster being, quite abundant then. And when that's gone, I'll go in the woods and I'll live off of acorns, right? I will go back to basics. I will suffer as long as it takes, right? I will be publicly virtuous as long as it takes before, going back to enjoying myself in any respect. So virtue was a measurable metric. It was done within the discerning gaze of the public.
Now, Paul Revere, who of course famously made his ride around the Lexington and Concord engagements, makes a cameo appearance here as well. He brings in the Suffolk Resolve. So yes. What are those?
So the Suffolk Resolves are probably one. So first of all, they have the distinguished honor of being the first thing that Parliament publicly recognizes and endorses. And the Suffolk Resolves are a recognition that something is going wrong in Massachusetts. It's effectively asking Congress rather. Part of it is asking Congress if they should remain in Boston or leave Boston. But they are a series of damnations, if you will. Effectively condemning the king. And really looking at the empire as an empire in crisis, and it's got quite militant language. So the Suffolk Resolves are embraced by Congress. They're endorsed by Congress, and it's a pretty stinging condemnation of the acts of Parliament.
Well, one of the key acts of this Congress are the Articles of Association. What are those, and why are they significant?
So it's my contention that the Articles of Association should be counted among the founding documents of the United States. There are 14 resolves, and they're usually, if they're mentioned at all, they're usually recognized as, another attempt at what usually goes into the textbooks as a boycott or an embargo or something to that effect. And that's true. That's not untrue, right? The articles ask merchants and ship captains to, not smuggle goods, to not price gouge. They ask for an effort on colonists' part to really dedicate themselves to not slaughtering sheep, right? To produce local clothing and not rely on British textiles. They warn individuals and provinces who don't adhere to the Articles of Association that they'll be condemned by supporters of the common cause as enemies to American liberty. And then there are two sort of less discussed elements, and that's really what the bulk of my work is about. The 8th article asks colonists to refrain from displays of wealth, horse racing, cockfighting, gambling, theater going, extravagant funerals. And the 11th article is the sort of enforcement mechanism that Congress offers, where it asks each town and county to create a committee of inspection and observation, and to elect men to these committees to enforce the resolves of Congress. And it's not all economic. It's make sure that there aren't horse races going on, make sure people aren't gambling, make sure there isn't theater happening, make sure if there are funerals that there isn't gift giving, and put these men out there, have them elected, and they'll have the full authority. They'll have the approval of Congress, which doesn't have any real authority, but they'll have the authority of the locality because they're being democratically elected. And this is effectively the democratization of the American Revolution at the local level. And we see something like 7,000 individuals elected to hundreds of these committees that are throughout the colonies, effectively patrolling their zones of austerity and making certain that the directives of Congress are being followed.
So that's a pretty significant amount of institution building going on outside of the official frameworks. So how does that contribute to this larger kind of pan-colonial identity?
Well, we have in print media a really impressive amount of literature. Many articles these publishers of these gazettes are publishing these committees at work. And we begin to see in the streets, in the seaport towns, right? These committees of observation checking ship cargoes, these committees of observation running people out of town, these committees of observation, in some instances getting quite violent and parading people around town as enemies of American liberty. Literature that's critical of the Articles of Association being collected and publicly, quote, burnt in detestation. The desire for authors or peddlers of such literature to be outed and to be publicly condemned as enemies to American liberty. And what ends up happening in these newspapers, in colonial newspapers, is what I call in the book a narrative of voluntary compliance. So just like print media did an outstanding job highlighting the movement of delegates to Philadelphia, they likewise do another remarkable job reflecting people listening to the committees of observation. Now, of course, there's a counterpoint to this, right? There's, in my book, I called loyalists imperial traditionalists because there's not exactly fighting going on. There's not a war just yet, and so I felt that that was a more appropriate term. People who were just more comfortable with the way that the empire worked. That I refer to them as imperial traditionalists. These individuals, they didn't see the merit in Congress. They didn't see the Articles of Association and what they call the creatures of Congress, the committees of observation, as legitimate actors. They see these and they see the committees as dangerous mobs. In one instance, they're compared to the Spanish Inquisition. But in the newspaper, mostly the narrative is people are listening to Congress. People are following the objectives of the committee. The committees of inspection and observation are doing their job. They are patrolling every once in a while. They'll be reflected in the gazettes. Someone who was breaking the directives of Congress, but when the committee stepped in, they publicly apologized. Now, of course, we can never know if they publicly apologized because they legitimately repented from their behavior, or they publicly apologized because it was just safer to do so. We'll never know that. But nevertheless, the way that it's reflected in the newspaper is that they were listening to Congress. They recognized the error of their ways. There are plenty of instances where, wine was imported, and the person who was supposed to receive the wine is notified by the his local committee of inspection and observation, and he says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that. Captain, my apologies for making you travel so far. Can you please remove these spirits? I refuse to take them." There's an instance of a character somewhere outside of Boston who was selling tea, and it's brought to his attention, brought to the committee's attention, and he says, "Oh my goodness, I cannot believe that I was profiting off of tea. Please take all the money that I made from selling this horrible weed and provide it to those suffering for the common cause, for the poor of Boston." So even when there are people who are caught, they're reflected in the newspapers almost every time out as people that quickly came to their senses. But I think the more important takeaway here is not only that the newspapers were recognizing in people coming to terms with what they did wrong, they're reflecting the authority of the committees of observation, and they're reflecting the benevolence of these committees. So again, and I think to a large degree, this is to counter the narrative that these committees are mobs. These committees are acting in unconstitutional ways. These committees are worse than the Spanish Inquisition. But if you read the newspapers, they're doing what the people wanted them to do because they're democratically elected institutions. Most people, most of the time, are just simply listening, and even those who aren't listening are gently nudged. "Hey, you're doing the wrong thing. Oh, I'm sorry." So it's I think a really important addition. Now, it's probably an illusion because there are some very serious instances of people pushing back against the Articles of Association and creating counter articles. But nevertheless, if your only window into what was going on in Boston was a local newspaper, and that local newspaper printer was sympathetic to the common cause, well, you'll be receiving mostly news that is sympathetic to Congress and its directives, and news that's going to reflect in the most benevolent way possible the actions of the committee.
Well, I want to return to Joseph Galloway. During the Congress, he proposes his own plan for organizing the empire in a way to solve some of these problems. What was his plan? So
Joseph Galloway is the only one who came to Congress with a plan. And he had this grand plan of union, is what he called it. And he imagined that there would be a colonial Congress, not unlike the First Continental Congress, that would handle specifically affairs of empire that specifically dealt with British North America. And he imagined that there would be members from England and members from the colonies. There would be a president that was an American that would be appointed by the king. And this would be a way for colonists to run interference, for lack of a better term, against legislation that Parliament might propose that affected the internal affairs of British North America. So it was a way of really restructuring the way that the empire worked. I mean, Galloway's a pretty fascinating character, and he holds a pretty long correspondence with a member of Parliament, where he actually criticizes Parliament and says, hey, look, you could have fixed these problems in 1765. We all recognize that there was a problem with the Stamp Act. Of course, the Stamp Act was not constitutional. We should have been working on this 9 years ago. But here we are. Here we are in 1774, and he tries to get this plan passed through Congress. And what they do is they quietly, table it. And it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's effectively erased from the contemporary records. We can read it now, of course. But he was quite upset about this. He came to Congress with a plan. He was deeply concerned with the direction that Congress was going in, and he was very excited to reveal his plan. And at least according to Galloway also has a correspondence with the governor of New Jersey, William Franklin, who's a loyalist, ultimately becomes a loyalist. And he says, look, everyone in Congress likes my plan, but those radicals tabled it. And he usually, when he's talking about radicals, he's usually referring to Sam Adams, who is a guy that he referred to, let me see if I can conjure this quote up, a man who is not brilliant, who eats little and drinks less, but is a master of political intrigue. You brought up Paul Revere a moment ago, and it's Galloway who recognizes that every once in a while, at just the right moment, news from Boston comes from Paul Revere. Whether it's Thomas Gage is attacking British citizens, or it's the Suffolk Resolve, whatever it is, it's this perfectly timed moment where congressmen would be debating over natural rights or how many votes should a colony have, or whatever kind of tense moment that deadlocked Congress or threatened to destroy the Congress before it got anything done. At this fortuitous moment, just by happenstance, Paul Revere would say, hey, they're shooting colonists in Boston now. And then, stop the debate. Everybody gets one vote. Forget about, weighing colonies by population or wealth. Everybody gets one vote. We're all in this together. They're shooting colonists. Of course, they weren't shooting colonists, but that was the news that Paul Revere would just suddenly drop. So, Galloway recognized that early on, and whenever he's referring to radicals, it seems clear that he's always referring to Sam Adams and whoever Adams was close with at the moment. But he does have a vision of empire. He did have a plan. I think the historiography on Galloway, and there are a couple of good articles by the great American historian John Ferling, and there are a couple earlier ones where Galloway is. His plan failed, according to like the earlier historians, because his conservatism didn't allow him to be creative or imaginative. And I just simply don't agree with that. I mean, he was quite creative. He had this incredible plan. The conclusion that I come to in my book is if Congress would have taken seriously Galloway's plan, which I think everyone recognized as a sound way, I mean, if the true objective of the Congress was imperial reconciliation, well, this was certainly one way to do it. No one else had a plan. I think that what happens is most of those delegates recognized that if they did say, yes to Galloway's plan, and they did send this off to King and Parliament as a legitimate method by which to solve the empire's problems, the fundamental objective that Congress had, which was to protect American liberties, right, and reconcile the empire, probably would have fallen by the wayside if Parliament even recognized Congress, because they didn't recognize Congress as legitimate. But I think that seems to be why Galloway's plan sort of gets disappeared, if you will, because a focus on that plan would have not been a focus on what brought the men to Philadelphia to begin with.
Newspapers at the time also published poetry. And can you talk about poetry as part of the resistance discourse?
Yes, there's and this trend continues into the first Washington administration as well. So we have some resistance poetry glorifying the year 1774. We have resistance poetry. One that I remember is a conversation between, let me see if I can get this right, William III and James II, I think, is the conversation. But it's really a conversation between the colonists and George III, where, James II is saying, hey, if you make these bad moves, you'll lose the crown. And of course, James II lost the crown. And it seems to me that it was a not too well concealed bit of advice to George III to not infringe upon colonial liberties. But certainly poetry enters the political lexicon as a way to discuss the crisis at hand. And there's also one famous poem that I think comes out in October of 1774 that begins to laud a new emerging American character.
Now, part of the self-denial was the no theater going, but people read plays, and you talk about theatrical republicanism. How important was theater to advancing this ideology?
So theater has always been a sophisticated form of entertainment, but it has also always been used as a method to discuss politics, whether we're going back into the Greek world or the Roman world, or even into the works of Shakespeare. The Shakespeare works are littered with nationalism and attacks on certain characters at court, disguised attacks, of course. Now, during the crisis period, it's true that Congress focused on theatrical productions as poisonous, as threatening the moral purity that they were searching for, but that's only the public production, and the logic behind this was ideological and economic. It was ideological in the respect that that Congress argued, and Congress is not alone, by the way. This is all over print media leading up to 1774, going back into the 1760s, where there were commentators arguing that theater is not conducive to Christianity, and that theater played a large role in sinking Athens into effeminacy and weakness. So if we get into 1774, there was a real fear that individuals who went to theater productions were passive observers. They were passively being entertained. And thus they were turning into the opposite of an independent actor. They were specifically dependent. They became robbed of all of their virtue. Again, no one needs to believe this, but this is the theory that many of these congressmen and observers were putting out there, that men would become too passive to defend life, liberty, and property. That women, ostensibly upper-class women, would be exposed to obscenities that they wouldn't be exposed to in otherwise good company. And if we get into the economics of it, theater productions cost money. Theater productions cost money in costumes. Theater productions cost money for people to be admitted to. And so we have waste at the top. These are not my words. This is their words, right, and thoughts. People are wasting their time putting on makeup and getting into costumes and memorizing lines while there's a legitimate crisis going on, while people in Boston are legitimately starving, while traditional rites and rituals and identities are being erased from the record, while British, civil servants rather, are being able to ostensibly act with impunity and not worry about being tried by a jury of colonial peers. There's waste in energy, waste in resources, and at the bottom, the poorest individuals shouldn't be spending money on a theater ticket and alcohol that they could otherwise be spending on food and fuel for their struggling families. So theater productions became really the opposite of the moral identity. If we look at like part of the revolutionary push, there's a moral element there. Who are Americans? And they are Americans, at least according to the Congress in 1774. True Americans are willing to sacrifice. True Americans are willing to do without in a time of crisis. True Americans are willing to pick up the suffering of their neighbors. Right? True Americans recognize that we're all in this together, and an attack on one is an attack on all. And so, thus, it stands to reason that no true American would waste their time memorizing lines or putting on makeup or even attending a theater production when there's so much suffering outside of the theater. Now, if we are looking for a defense of theater, of course, Congress never bans the production. I mean, the writing, rather, of theater. And you know, Mercy Otis Warren and Breckinridge and even Philip Freneau, there are Americans that are still writing theater because I think Congress recognizes very clearly that there are moral objectives to be learned from the private consumption of plays. And so going to a play is a waste of resources from top to bottom. Going to plays is an insult to those suffering in Boston. If you have an evening on it, I'm going to go see a play on Tuesday and I'm going to, really enjoy it. And meanwhile, children are starving in Boston. That's a direct assault on American moral purity. But if you are reading a play in the privacy of your own home, you are absorbing the moral and ethical objectives of the revolutionary push.
So we have just a few minutes left. Talk about at what point do you really see this common American identity emerge?
That's tricky to answer. And I sort of close my book with a discussion about that. It's a process that happens for American Whigs at different rates. Patrick Henry says famously in 1774 that there are no longer Virginians, there are no longer New Yorkers, there are no longer New Englanders and Southerners, there are only Americans. But in the same breath, he's angry that Rhode Island's going to have the same authority that Virginia is going to have. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. There's the famous poem that comes out that lauds this new emerging American character. By 1776, there's poetry that's expressing how remarkable it is to be an American, whatever that means, because there's never really a tight description of it. We begin to see certainly a commitment to Congress's directives, and that commitment is displayed in public. People who are willing to not go to the theater, people who refuse to go to horse races, people who refuse to gamble, people who refuse to have expensive funerals. I mean, that was one of the darker moments when I was researching this. I spent weeks reading through obituaries, but lots of these obituaries that are published were saying, if you want to be a true patriot, hold your funeral the way that I held mine, right? Were the last words of some of these individuals. There's not a clear-cut answer to this, is what I'm getting at, right? This is a process, but there is a great quote that I found from John Adams when he's the second president of the United States, and he offers a eulogy for Washington after learning of Washington's death in December of 1799. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but it's like certainly, by the 1790s, there are actors as serious and as thoughtful as John Adams who are looking back at the revolutionary moment, and they're identifying 1774. And he says, Washington was one of those characters who belonged to the association of 1774. And that association was the first expression of a sovereign American people. So in other words, Adams, 20 years later, right, more than 20 years later, is looking back and saying, if there is a starting point for an American political community, it's organized around Boston's suffering and Congress's directives that we see in 1774 as the Articles of Association.
We've been speaking with Shawn David McGhee. He is the author of No Longer Subjects of the British King, The Political Transformation of Royal Subjects to Republican Citizens. Shawn, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.